Vernon Miller was a freelance prohibition gunman, bootlegger, bank robber, and former sheriff in Huron, South Dakota. He was the only identified gunman in the Kansas City Massacre. On May 31, 1930, after a friend of Miller's, Eugene McLaughlin, had been killed by members of Al Capone's Chicago outfit, Miller tracked down 3 of the suspects to a resort hotel in Fox Lake, Illinois, and gunned them down. This event was later known as the Fox Lake Massacre and was attributed to members of George Moran's North Side Gang. Before we begin, welcome back. Please take a second and subscribe to the Past Crimes channel if you have not already. Remember to like this video if you found it informative. Vernon Miller was born in Kimball, South Dakota on August 25, 1896. He moved 35 miles northeast to Huron in 1914, where he worked as an auto mechanic. Miller enlisted in the United States Army 2 years later, in 1916, and saw action in a Mexican expedition into Mexico following repeated bandit raids across the U.S.-Mexico border. Miller served in France with the 18th Infantry Regiment after the United States entered into World War I and was decorated for valor and bravery. By the end of the war, he had risen through the ranks to the rank of color sergeant. Miller returned to Huron after being discharged from the military in 1918 and joined the city's police force as a patrolman. In 1920, he resigned from the Huron Police Department. Miller later ran for sheriff of Beadle County, in which he was victorious in the election. Miller grew tired of his job after 2 years and fled in 1922 after withdrawing $4,000 from county revenue. Miller was quickly apprehended by investigators and convicted of embezzlement on April 4, 1923. Miller was able to become the warden's personal chauffeur while imprisoned at the South Dakota State Penitentiary and was granted parole in November 1924. Prohibition had been fully implemented across the country by the time Miller was released. Following his release, he entered the lucrative bootlegging business. Miller had a clean record for a few years after being fined $200 for bootlegging in Sioux Falls, South Dakota in October 1925. Miller became increasingly unstable in the late 1920s after years of heavy drug abuse and suffering from advanced syphilis, and he had frequent unpredictable bursts of violence. On February 3, 1928, he was charged with the wounding of 2 Minneapolis police officers, but the case was dropped due to a lack of evidence. Miller was well known as a freelance gunman who was mostly hired by bootleggers and racketeers in the Midwest. After a friend of Miller's, Eugene "Red" McLaughlin, was murdered by members of Al Capone's Chicago outfit on May 31, 1930, Miller tracked down 3 of the known suspects. They were staying at a resort in Fox Lake, Illinois. On June 1, he gunned them down. The event became known as the Fox Lake Massacre. The event was attributed to George Moran's North Side Gang. On July 15, 1930, as the end of Prohibition approached, Miller joined forces with Harvey Bailey, George "Machine Gun" Kelly, and 3 others in a daylight raid that resulted in the theft of $70,000 from a bank in Wilmar, Minnesota. On August 13, in an argument over a double-cross from the bank robbery, Miller killed Frank Weenie Coleman, Mike Ruzick, and Jew Sammy Stein and dumped their bodies at White Bear Lake. Miller's relationship with his accomplices did not appear to be affected by the murders, as he joined Bailey, Holden, Keating, Kelly, and Lawrence Duvall in robbing a bank in Ottumwa, Iowa, for $40,000 on September 9, 1930. Miller stole another $40,000 from a bank in Sherman, Texas, with Bailey, Kelly, Frank Jelly Nash, and several others on April 8, 1931. The Miller gang killed 2 Minneapolis police officers during a bank robbery on December 16, 1932. Miller retired from armed robbery in favor of murder for hire after the Sherman bank robbery, though he maintained contact with his former partners. Through these contacts, Miller was hired to free former partner Frank Nash from federal custody while he was being transported to Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary. Miller and several other unidentified gunmen ambushed federal agents as they arrived at Union Station in Kansas City, Missouri, on June 17, 1933. Miller and the other gunmen fled the scene after a brief but violent gunfight that killed Nash and 4 law enforcement officers while injuring 2 others. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover named Pretty Boy Floyd and Adam Eddie Ricchetti as suspects and active participants in the Kansas City Massacre. However, evidence suggests otherwise. Miller fled to the East Coast after the Kansas City Massacre, staying with New Jersey mobster Abner Zwillman in Orange, New Jersey, until Miller killed the Zwillman gunman in an argument. Miller arrived in Chicago on October 23, 1933, and posed to be a salesman for an optical supply house while living with girlfriend V. Mathis until federal agents raided her apartment on November 1. Miller was able to flee federal agents by shooting his way out. Despite the fact that Miller and the federal agents exchanged gunfire, no one was seriously injured. Mathis and another friend, Bobby Moore, are quickly arrested. Miller will never be seen alive again by the women or the FBI. Less than a month later, on November 29, 1933, Miller's body was discovered in a roadside ditch outside of Detroit, Michigan. He had been beaten and strangled to death. He appeared to be the victim of a gangland slaying. Although the cause of Miller's death remains unclear, it is believed that the following were possible: retaliation by Zwillman for the murder of his gang member, punishment over failure to free Nash, or retribution for the previous Fox Lake Massacre. V. Mathis is released 3 months before her year-long sentence is finished. She is immediately detained by FBI agents and interrogated over a 12-day period about her knowledge of the Kansas City Massacre and other information about her lover, Vernon Miller. In October 1934, Miller's alleged accomplices, Adam Ricchetti and Pretty Boy Floyd, are discovered in Ohio by state authorities. Ricchetti is captured, Floyd is killed in the chase by state and federal agents. Vernon Miller was the only positively identified gunman in the Kansas City Massacre. In December of 1932, Miller was also the driver of the getaway car for the infamous Barker Gang when they held up the 3rd Northwestern Bank of Minneapolis.